So, we just added images to our beautiful view, and I promised that we would come back to the idea of dispatch queues, which we saw in the code right here. Let me close this out on the right so that you can get a better look at this code. What have we done? Well, inside of this did-set block for the bird, we switched to the global dispatch queue with a user-initiated quality-of-service, and we used that to get a hold of some image data from a URL containing a bird image. Once we had that data, we switched back to a main queue and put that data into an image and displayed it on the screen. So let's back out for a second and talk a little bit about mobile software development. We've talked about a few things that are unique to mobile software development, and we'll go over those again now. So when you're working in a browser, you don't necessarily have to consider some of the things as closely as you do in mobile software development. So the first one that we've talked about is UI flexibility, because there are so many devices and different orientations for each device. This is a characteristic of mobile software development. Another one that we've talked about is object conservation. We want to keep our apps as low memory as possible because we're operating on these teeny little devices that just don't have as much memory available to us as a big computer that we might run other programs on. Another thing that's important is dealing with unreliable service, because you may have your phone in an area with poor internet or cellular connectivity, and you want to determine how to make your app as useful as possible under those circumstances. Say you're hiking or you're on the tarmac of an airport. I've actually worked on an app that was for people who worked on the tarmac of an airport, and it was extremely important that the app work if they didn't have access to the internet, which is something that we unfortunately didn't consider in the first draft of the app, and so the second draft took a really long time. So it's this third one, unreliable service, that our dispatch queues are going to help us with today. What is the dispatch queue? Well, you can have multiple threads of operation inside of an iOS app. And iOS provides you with a library called Grand Central Dispatch that manages those for you. You hook into that management system by creating these dispatch queues, or rather, using these dispatch queues. You have several dispatch queues available to you, and you can schedule work to occur on different queues depending on how urgent it is that something be accomplished in your application. Let's say that you weren't using these dispatch queues for a moment, and you had everything occur by default on the main queue, which is the queue that's used to manage the user interface of your application. When you make a network call, your user interface would freeze, and you wouldn't be able to do anything on the app until that call came back. Now, suppose you had a really poor internet connection or a really poor cellular connection, or that site was just down and it took 30 seconds for the site to time out for you. Your app is now frozen until you get that data back or until it times out. And that user experience can be really poor. So here's what we do instead. When we need to get some data from the internet here in our bird cell, we shell out to the dispatch queue.global, and we specify a quality of service. We then say that this work should happen asynchronously on that queue. Let's talk about what all this means. So we will hold down the Option key and click on this global word, which tells us what the global queue is. This says, in summary, dispatch queue.global returns the global system queue with the specified quality of service class. We can pass in the quality of service that we need for this work to be done. Now, let's find out a little bit more about that quality of service class. So I'm going to hold down Option and click on User Initiated here. In summary, the quality of service class, User Initiated, is for tasks that prevent the user from actively using the app. Let's get some more information about the quality of service classes. In order to do that, in the bottom right of the quick help that I've opened, I see Open in Developer Documentation as a link. I'm going to click on that. Great. So here we see Dispatch QoS class User Initiated. So it looks like User Initiated is one option in the Quality of Service class. I want to find out a little bit more about the Quality of Service classes that are available to me. So I'm going to search the documentation for Dispatch QoS.QoS class up here. Alternatively, here in my in this top bar, I can see the hierarchy of classes in iOS from Dispatch to Dispatch Queue to Dispatch QoS class to User Initiated. I'm going to click on this orange one, QoS class, and that's going to take me to the documentation for that. It says that we use quality of service classes to communicate the intent behind the work that our app performs, and we see that we have a number of options here. The first one is User Interactive, the quality of service class for user interactive tasks like animations, event handling, or updating the app's user interface. This is one that you might use for tapping on buttons or something for a user, and it is the highest quality of service class. These actions are priority. They should happen quickly so that the interface appears to be extremely responsive to the person using the application. Next, we have User Initiated, the quality of service class for tasks that prevent the users from actively using your app. This is the one that you might want to use for a task that you're expecting to take a few seconds, and this one you don't want blocking the UI. Then we have Default, which appears somewhere between User Initiated and Utility. This one really iOS developers shouldn't be using to schedule things. This one's more used by iOS under the hood. And I can show you where you can get that information later, but I want to summarize it for you now. So then we have Utility, the quality of service class for tasks that the user does not track actively. So this might be something that's going to take maybe a minute to a few minutes. Let's say that this is downloading a podcast or something like that, where you want it to happen kind of where the user isn't blocked by that task, and it's going to take a little bit, but it's not going to take, say, hours. If you have something that's going to take hours, that's something that you want to have happening in a background task. This is the quality of service class for maintenance or cleanup tasks that you create. So this might be really long-running updates, or maybe downloading something really large. If you are downloading something really large and your user is going to be waiting on it, the best practice in that scenario might be to download it in chunks so that a user can get to the beginning part of it while the rest of it loads over the course of hours in the background. That's something that you might set up if you were in charge of creating the back end for your mobile apps. And we can talk a little bit more at a future time about practices for building backends that are designed to serve mobile applications. Great. So we see this. Let's back up one more in the documentation to the dispatch queue itself. And here you can see that you can get even more information about the dispatch queue. Finally, if we return to the quality of service class, here we can come over to the right-hand side, and I want you to see some of what you are able to determine contextually from this documentation. We can see that the language of this is Swift. If you have a library that's available in Swift and Objective-C, you'll see an option here. So for example, if I go to UIKit, I can click on Swift or Objective-C. I can see in which SDK this library was introduced. So this is a pretty old one. We've had it since iOS 2. We can also get a hold of it for tvOS, watchOS, and Mac Catalyst. We can see the framework that something's a part of. So if I were in some subcomponent of UIKit, I would see UIKit there, like this. And then we can see on this page what might be available to us. Good. So at this point, if I don't have all the information that I want after looking at the documentation, I might turn to the internet. This is something that I might do if I wanted to see an example, because documentation is really good at telling me the options that are available to me, but it doesn't necessarily show me examples of how or why I might use different pieces of code. In that case, I might be looking for something like a blog post. I have found this blog post about multi-threading in iOS, which provides additional information about the different quality of service classes and what we might use them for. It's worth noting that these tables actually do come from the iOS documentation. So as you're searching for things online, you may find yourself switching back and forth between the official documentation and unofficial documentation or fan nonfiction of blog posts from people who have studied this information. So that's how I might go about getting more information about what's happening under the hood in iOS using my documentation. Let's switch back to our code for a second and see if we have a little bit of a better understanding of what's happening here. So when we want to make this call, we switch onto the global queue with the user-initiated quality-of-service, the one that's going to take a couple seconds maybe. We asynchronously run that. So while this is running, the user can still interact with the UI. Then once we have that data, we switch back to that main queue, which is blocking, which is fast, which is for that UI, right? And at that point, we use our data to set that image view and to set a change to that image view. Then we let iOS handle the threading behind the scenes with these dispatch queues from Grand Central Dispatch.